Hello and welcome to the podcast for the HNC Radio and Podcasting course, first one of the year. And we're very excited by the guests we've got on. Please let me introduce Patrick Dunne and Katie Smith of 1.5 Degrees Live. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, let me introduce the students that we've got here. Now, I'm going to do it in directional order. This may not be the same for everyone else, so it may be a bit strange about why certain people are coming in at certain times. But I've got up at the top, we've got Declan.
Hi.
Then we've got Michael.
Hello.
I've got Abdul Karim.
Hi.
We've got Paolo.
Hi, nice to meet you.
And we've got Sky.
Hi guys, I'm Sky. It's a pleasure to formally be introduced.
And then we've got Rebecca.
Hello.
And we've got Maddie.
Hi, lovely to have you here.
And then we have Mia.
Hi.
So those are all the students, and they're the ones who are very much going to be taking charge. They're the ones that have written the questions, prepared the questions. So they're the ones that have organised all of this. So I shall let them carry on. Declan, I believe you've got the first question.
Yes, I do. What is it that 1.5 degrees live do exactly?
So 1.5 Degrees Live, we started in 2019. In 2018, the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released a big report about the impacts of global warming and the difference between the increase in warming of 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees. So 1.5 degrees was the kind of the agreement that came out of the Paris agreements a few years ago. And then they commissioned a big study to look at what would happen if we got to 1.5 and compared the impacts of that to what would happen at 2 degrees. And it was probably the most famous climate report ever made. It took the world by storm in lots of ways, and it was part of a huge mushrooming of lots of climate activism. It was the same time as Greta Thunberg was around and became very high profile. Extinction Rebellion appeared on a bridge in London, and everybody was suddenly talking about this climate report, this 1.5 degrees report. Katie and I at that stage were getting pretty anxious about all things climate related. We live in Edinburgh, so we're aware of the fringe, and we'd heard about a show that some comedians had put on a couple of years previously, where they read out a big report by the government about the Iraq war, and they built a shed, and they
it read 24 hours a day for like 2.5 weeks or something.
And they said, like, this report is going to be commissioned by the government and it's going to sit on a shelf in Westminster, and if we don't read it out, it's never going to get the light of day. And that was several years ago, and Katie and I had a conversation. We said somebody should do that with this climate report, because if we don't read it, no one's ever going to read it. And then we were the only people in that conversation.
So we gathered, I think it was 140 people in the end, all sorts of people, some famous, some ordinary, and read it over 50 hours in the fringe. So yes, because it was all about aiming for 1.5 degrees. It was 1.5 degrees live, and since then we've repeated that report in a couple of other places, and
Australia, New Zealand.
Well, we did, other people did it in Australia and New Zealand, which was great, and Scottish Parliament and down in London, and then recently we did a wee reading of the newest report that came out, which you might have seen in the papers, the first part of the new report, which was pretty sobering reading, and a good thing to do with other people, I think. Not the kind of thing you necessarily want to read by yourself.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a second question, but it might be a repeat of your first answer. Was there any particular event or reason that's pushed you further than before? As you've described with the Iraq thing, has there any been like particular events or anything that's made you have to go further than you first thought on the climate change topic?
we were just starting to get involved in Extinction Rebellion at that time, and that was happening, and it seemed to be happening in this kind of really exciting way where like loads of people were like doing something at last, whereas we had like a long time of really bad news and nobody seemed to be doing anything. And then suddenly like hundreds of people were turning up at meetings, and like this exciting community of people were getting together to like take part in activism and say like we can't carry on as we are doing. And I know there's lots of conversations about like tactics and all that kind of stuff, but at that time it was this really exciting, energetic, like thank goodness people are finally doing something, and we were a part of that. And I think some of that atmosphere gave us the courage. We have no right to putting on a fringe show. And we're not climate scientists. We've got no idea what we're doing. We had no money. We're not actors. We're not comedians. We've nothing to do with the fringe. But I think part of that atmosphere made us think, we're just going to make it happen. So I think that helped, that kind of collective activism helped us be like, we can be brave enough to do this.
And I think something that, is maybe different depending on your age. So this, might be a very different experience for you guys. But I think a lot of the time, a lot of my life, I kind of thought, I feel really sorry for the people in the future who climate change is going to happen to. And that 2018 report, and then also the weather and the climate events that happened then, that was when I was like, okay, it's my lifetime. It's not just me I need to worry about, it's my parents I need to worry about. And I think lots of people think, I need to worry about my grandchildren. And I think that report became that change. And when it was saying, 12 years to save the world, that was the big headlines in the newspapers. And I find that completely terrifying, but also everything else in the world became less terrifying than that. So the idea of like
putting on a fringe show, like suddenly much less terrifying. The idea of like being part of an illegal protest, much less terrifying. So yes, it was a bit of a shift in perspective.
Yeah, thank you for answering my questions.
Pleasure.
Abdul Karim, you have a couple of questions.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Connor. So do you feel it is too late to be tackling climate change, or do we still have time?
I think this is a thing that I think sometimes in the media or sometimes in the kind of delaying tactics, people say, it's too late, or it's too expensive, or maybe we shouldn't do anything. And it's kind of a funny way of looking at it, because actually what it's more like is if you think of like you put a cake in the oven and you've left it a bit too long and it's slightly burnt. That's where we're at. And it's the time to turn the oven off, even though the cake is slightly burnt. But if we don't turn the oven off, the cake will just continue to get more burnt until it goes on fire and the house goes on fire. So even if the whole of the UK was up to its knees in floodwater, it's still not too late, because the warmer, or the higher that warming gets, the more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the worse the situation is. So every action counts. Like every ton of CO2 or less than a ton, whatever, it all makes a difference. So yes, it's always the time to take action.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that thing of for years there's been lots of delays. We've known, scientists have known, oil companies have known for decades. People have been concerned about this for a long time, and now we seem to be at a stage where people are suddenly saying it's too late, whereas 5 years ago it wasn't a problem. But it never seems to be like the right time to carry on Katie's kind of cake analogy, because why not? We seem to be currently in the kitchen watching the cake burn, waiting for somebody to come home with a like cake fixing device that has not yet been invented yet. There's this thing of like, we'll just carry on as we are. because we're, the human race is very innovative, and we're going to kind of have some sort of technological fix in the future that's going to solve all of our problems. And you know what? We are quite clever, and somebody might come up with a scientific solution to remove carbon from the atmosphere. But climate change is driven by global extractivism and exploitation of natural resources, including the exploitation and destruction of communities and cultures and countries all over the world. Much less so here, but certainly in other parts of the world. But we benefit from all of that kind of stuff. So even if we magically remove all of the carbon out of the atmosphere, what about the
we're still left
justice?
With a rubbish system.
Yeah, and piles of plastic bottles in Mauritius, and communities being poisoned in Nigeria, and on and on and on and on. And so the climate change and the carbon issue is part of a wider social and economic and political thing, and we can improve all of that right now. Yeah.
There's a very beautiful line from the 1.5 degrees report, which is often described as kind of a dry scientific report, but there's some really beautiful bits in it, and it's very adamant about justice. And there's a line saying that to stick to 1.5 degrees it gives us this opportunity for intentional social transformation. So this idea, now is the time to change things. We have to change things, and it gives but there's so many good things that could come from changing things. We all know loads of rubbish that exists within our global system, and colonialism, capitalism, and climate change all come from the same thing, along with biodiversity loss. Powerful reason to change the system, but changing the system could be great.
Yeah, interesting, I must say. So now, what are the most visible or worrying signs of climate change?
I think Katie came home today and said, "Did you see that the tubes in London have flooded again?" I don't think we need to look very far at the moment for the impacts of climate change. Record-breaking droughts, ever-increasing amounts of refugees, fires, unbelievable fires in Siberia. People dying in Australia. They were talking earlier on in the summer of areas getting so hot that the human body can't cope, and not just in Death Valley or whatever, but in large parts of Australia and America, North America. I think every day there are visible signs, and how long wars over water and resources and power and all of this kind of stuff is happening right now. It's not always sometimes I think framed in that way, but I think the signs are everywhere.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe not possible to say what the worst or the most worrying signs are. I think probably the most worrying fact is that we, human activity and capitalism and extractivism is destabilizing so many global Earth systems, whether that's air quality or water quality or currents or plastic pollution or biodiversity or all these kind of things. There's so many things being destabilized simultaneously. And what the newest report, the sixth assessment report, it's a catchy title, but what that report says is that what we have created and are continuing to create is a world that is much more unpredictable. So the idea of seeing major extremes that we can't predict, and whether that's the 50-degree heat in Canada recently, or locust swarms, or New York's first ever major flooding, or whatever it is. We've created something very unpredictable. So in every way. So yes, I guess it's all kind of worrying. but also everything we do, there's so, because everything affects everything, there's so many ways that good actions for the system can take so many forms, that there's lots of things that we can do, and if you find the thing that's your thing and you contribute, then you contribute in lots of different ways.
Madeline, you've got a question now.
Yeah. So you've spoken about the signs or the daily changes of climate change. And I just wanted to ask, why do you think a lot of people still continue to view climate change as a non-issue?
I think it's a scary thing to think about, and there's lots of other stuff to think about. And people want to not think about something as big and as potentially overwhelming and terrifying. Where do you start kind of thinking about it? I think most people, I'd like to think, would accept that it's a big issue, but it might not be the most pressing issue. People have, jobs and children and debts and relationships and lots of other things that might feel more present or kind of pressing. And it's difficult to spend your whole time thinking about the potential for kind of global systemic collapse. It's not that much fun. And there's also the hope that somebody else will fix it, or that it's going to be okay, that there's going to be a technological fix that surely if it was that bad, we'd be doing more about it. We wouldn't be opening a new oil field in Shetland, and we'd be a bit more welcoming to, refugees, and we'd be all of these things. And maybe it's not so bad. And, I think a lot, if you're immersed in this stuff and if you read a lot about it and you're doing a lot of activism, it can be all around you. But that is not the reality for lots of people. There's other things to kind of think about. And it can be much nicer to not think about the IPCC report and the implications of it, I think.
Sure. I think it's interesting that Greta Thunberg talks about her Asperger's as a factor for her in not being able to distract herself and turn away. And actually, as humans, we're pretty good, a lot of us, in distracting ourselves from the big stuff. But also, I think, individually, we can say, oh yeah, I don't want to think about it, whatever. But systemically, all of our media, pretty much, almost all our newspapers are owned by people who are billionaires, who have, a stake in just continuing things the way they are. Our politics is run by people who are very wealthy, who have a stake in things as they are. And the media reporting of climate change has been horrendous. If you think about the media response to climate change and the government and the media and the government response to COVID, we know that massive systemic change is possible overnight. We know that there is, in fact, a magic money tree. But those things, people make a huge amount of money out of the system as it is. And at the very core, really, in lots of ways, of the problem is that our economic system is based on growth. And there always has to be more. We always have to take more from the natural world in order to maintain growth. And growth is what pays. So to change the system and to end the problem, there's a lot of really, really big vested interests. And there's some fascinating exposés of how oil companies have spent a lot of time misleading us all, and how the sort of techniques and fake focus groups and the amount of money that goes into misinformation about fossil fuel companies is bigger than the amount of money that goes into like renewables. So it's been a deliberate strategy to like mislead us and confuse us and make us think, oh, maybe it's not that bad, or maybe it's not actually true. So I think, yeah.
There's a great book called Merchants of, we've got loads of links of stuff that we've made for various fringes. We'll share those, but there's a great book called Merchants of Doubt by two journalists and scientists, and they look at oil company and fossil fuel companies like tactics and how they created a debate, and they didn't have to prove that fossil fuels weren't the cause. They just had to say that there's a debate about it, and it was the same tactics and the same lawyers and the same PR companies that the tobacco companies used to create a debate around cancer and smoking. So they didn't need to say that cancer doesn't cause smoking. They just needed to say there's a debate. Nobody knows. It's not clear, so we can't really legislate on this or that because it's not clear. And it was this huge like industry of, you don't even have to prove anything. You just have to say there's both sides, and you see that kind of stuff all the time. And a lot of the media companies, they are obliged to have like both sides of the argument.
It's only last year that the BBC put out a directive to all staff to say, if you interview someone about climate change, you do not have to also involve a climate change denier.
Didn't stop them necessarily.
Which is amazing because like the scientific consensus on climate change is like, rock solid, really.
I mean, that question of like, that is such a big question of that whole, public information and like corporate information and all that kind of stuff is, you could talk for hours. You could do an entire university like degree and masters and PhD and like spend your whole life like looking at that whole system and where it comes from. And yeah, I mean, it's super interesting and depressing.
Sorry, that's a very long answer to the question, Maddie.
Cool. Well, we're going to hand over now to Sky, and she's got a couple of questions.
Hi. Oh my goodness, I'm loving this. You guys have some fantastic answers. I am going to change the topic a little bit to kind of more young people in activism. Actually. So obviously, over the past kind of 3 to 4 years, kind of since 2019, young people have taken a massive step up in the climate action and activism scene, with young people particularly being at the forefront of the largest climate strike in Scottish history back on September 20th, 2019. Absolutely brilliant thing that happened. So my question for you guys is, why do you think kind of young people have fallen into a leadership position kind of in this movement?
I think like technology has really helped. I think people have been able to like contact each other and have an international network that was not dependent on anything other than like their phones. And I think when Greta started, an entire global network of people started striking and continue to strike. And you can follow, the guys sitting in front of, municipal buildings in Cork in Ireland and, Uganda and South America. And they could all like talk to each other on Twitter or Instagram or like whatever. And so they were able to create this incredible network with no resources and there was no money or infrastructure required to do any of that stuff. So that I thought was really like helpful.
And I think like in a more, I think one of the, like there's a certain clear-sightedness that comes from young people, and that ability to say, I think I think there's always an answer. Oh, it would kind of be difficult to change that, or like, oh, it doesn't really work like that, or you don't understand the system. And actually, to not, I think there's so many young people leading activism who are not already co-opted by the system, who are not already like, who are able to look and be like, oh, look, the carbon is going up. That's kind of like, that's all we need to know. Whereas I think like a lot of like activism and, a lot of people that have been involved in this and in politics will say, oh, well, you win some, you lose some. There's been this gain there, and there's been that, and it's kind of complicated, but we can't kind of work this out. And I think it's like awesome to have there's so much like moral authority from young people to say, this is my future. Like, you might be dead when we reach 3 degrees, but I might have to live with it. So that's incredible. And I think also young people are like coming to their political awareness at a time when there is a massive existential threat, and people, like it's the things to take notice of, and like all those, there's potentially like, I look at my friends who have children and I think, how do you ever think straight for 2 minutes together, so maybe that's an opportunity as well. But I think it's like fabulous that like I think that with the kind of like changes and awareness that people have around justice nowadays, I feel like young people have grown up with a much more nuanced and complex idea of social justice, that kind of like, the people who have like, doing your political learning and coming into that with Black Lives Matters and with lots of like debate around gender rights and recognition and that kind of thing, and the complexity of identity and what that means, what privilege means, and at a point where there's also talk again about empire and colonialism and the history and stuff. And I think, when I was at school, it was illegal to mention that there were gay relationships of any kind. And I went through the entire school system and no one told me that Britain had an empire. So I guess like that's another thing to think, I think like climate justice is so important. And that's like generational justice, that's racial justice, that's gender justice, that's like every kind of like intersectionality justice. And I think young people are maybe like swim in that sea a little bit more, whereas some of that stuff's a bit more of a mind shift for older people. Anything else?
No, I think that's good.
Would you guys agree if I turned around and said, like, do you think the openness and kind of the ability to be able to speak about these matters has been an advantage for young people in the climate action kind of scene?
So repeat the question. You just broke up a little bit.
Sorry about that. Would you say that like kind of the openness and the freedom to speak about these kind of major issues in this generation has been an advantage for them during like the kind of climate activism and action scene?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that like it was so. Some of the big gatherings, the 20,000 people in Hollywood Park and like hundreds of thousands of people in Berlin and Amsterdam and all over the world, it made it really difficult for politicians to just ignore them. Whereas if, they want to ignore like dreadlocked 30-year-olds up trees and those people are easy to ignore. God bless them, the ones that are up trees. And I've nothing against dreadlocks. But like, 12-year-olds and younger are like really difficult to ignore for politicians. And they've done some, lots of politicians have been embarrassed and shamed and, forced publicly into like making statements and making promises that they would really rather not do because they were trapped by like school children. And it was like, and they couldn't get out of it. And also I think because young people were able to organize and communicate with each other without an older generation saying that classic thing that every kind of civil rights and activist movement has ever had from like suffragettes or whatever, that like slow down, your time will come, slow down, civil rights will come, and we can't go too soon and we can't go too quickly and all that kind of stuff. The young people have been able to create their own spaces and be active in spaces where nobody's telling them that.
So and it's we have to say, as not young people, that they might be.
Well, yeah, but not within their own spaces, presumably, So, whereas I think, there would be lots of people, urging them to kind of quiet down and just calm down, dear, as David Cameron so terribly said in Parliament that time, And they've been able to organise incredible stuff. When those 20,000 people came to Hollywood Park, that was a whole load of 15-year-olds organised that, or 12-year-olds or something. We had this young person come to read when we did 1.5 Degrees Live at the Fringe, and he turned up, I think, on his bike or something, and he was 13 and he looked 9. He was tiny, and I thought he was there with an adult, because I soon learned my lesson. And he was like, "Oh no, I'm here to do the reading." And he sat there, and not only did he read it, but he explained the headlines of the IPCC report to all these people. And he was, as we got to know him over the next kind of year, 18 months, he was organising all sorts of incredible stuff. And I think there is a generation of young people who have learned some unbelievable organising skills and ways to kind of do democracy and conversation and debate and stuff that is going to be, that is transformative.
I think one of the interesting things about young people in activism is that I think a lot of people still have this idea that climate change is a future issue. So people say, "Oh, educate more. Oh, what we need to do is do stuff more in schools." But that time has passed. I'm, how old am I? 36. And when I was 6 or 7, I remember my mum saying to me, "Oh, Katie, my generation has really messed stuff up. Your generation is going to have to fix it." I was like, "I am 7. You are 37. Your generation has to fix it." And I think this is the other thing, people put so much onto children and young people, and it is not children and young people that children and young people doing a staggeringly good job about putting this in the headlines. But children and young people do not run the World Bank, or run governments. That is being done by people in their 50s and 60s who have
70s and 80s.
Privilege and wealth and experience. And that thing of "Oh, let's get a selfie with Greta Thunberg and let's give her a applause as she tells us how dreadful we are." There's a lot of patronising that happens to young people, and there's a lot of using young people as these ones are the ones that are going to do something. And I think the thing that young people are doing amazingly is holding people to account, but someone else has to make that change, and it shouldn't be left on the show. I can't imagine what my teenage years would have been like if I had known what I know about the climate change now and that uncertainty about the future. And I can't imagine what it would be like to know that at 7 or 8 or 9. So I think, hats off to folk who've been activists. I think it's completely staggering, and the thing to do is, force that not to be a young people's issue.
Well, you also kind of answered my second question there. Was obviously you mentioned the gathering of 20,000 people in Hollywood Park, and you mentioned young people helping read your report and stuff like that. But apart from those actions, have you seen young people kind of take any other actions that you think are really impressive or that you want to mention?
I think, there are young people that I've seen from the school strikes that now, I often will see at events, or organising with a megaphone, with a high vis, organising and just making protests happen. So there's a few kind of faces that are heavily involved in stuff, and very impressive.
There's been some fabulous lawsuits coming from young people, which I think is a really interesting form of activism. And I really, I mean, it's a long-term strategy, but a really interesting strategy to take. I
think the Scottish Government or the Education Department have been kind of embarrassed into, apparently there are questions in the climate change section of, whatever the key stage is now, where they had to talk about, there was an expectation that people would have to talk about like the benefits of climate change, presumably, areas that were covered in ice in the, and now you can grow crops on or whatever.
Extract oil in the Arctic.
Yeah. And, places will be a bit warmer or whatever. So I think kids at school have, shamed people into having that kind of absurdity removed. And
it's interesting. I mean, there's like, you hear these nice stories of like a 5-year-old who's written to the supermarket and said, why are you doing this? This is daft, and that making a change. And you see like young people who have like, taken like steps to like glue themselves to a bank that's doing terrible things, and and then you see like I loved that video of the students in America who met Nancy Pelosi, didn't they?
Yeah.
And really embarrassed her and that thing of like, being assumed to be like young and naive, and being able to turn that another way. And I think, there's one of the things about like making a better world is that there's just thousands of ways, and I think young people are involved in everything. There's like there's some really amazing stuff.
There were some young people in Scotland recently, I can't remember the organisation, Uprising or something like that. They asked Nicola Sturgeon about Cambo, the Cambo oil fields, and there was a very embarrassing 2 minutes of Nicola Sturgeon not being able to denounce Cambo and attempting to end the conversation, and the interviewers refusing to let her get off the hook. And it was really masterfully done, and got huge exposure, and was massively embarrassing for Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. And in a campaign that is ongoing about like the Cambo oil fields, that was one of the like initial like really blew up viral videos of a politician getting like skewered by somebody, and she was 15 or 16 and a school pupil, and it was great. So there's a lot of really, really good stuff happening from young people.
I think there's the very visible stuff, and there's also that there's the like day-to-day stuff, and being part of your community, or sharing things, or finding ways to support people, or like finding ways to kind of step out of capitalist relations, and like being part of the communities is what we're going to need in terms of like dealing with disasters and stuff as they come, and dealing with things like COVID and stuff. So there's so much going on. Anyway. Hope that answers your question.
Cool. And now, Paulo, you have a question.
My question follows Sky's topic. Do you think they will be able to affect the changes the world needs?
Do you mean the young people or
the young people? Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking about, because we saw your questions briefly in advance. We were talking about this beforehand, and
we had a difference of opinion, didn't we?
Paddy's feeling very bleak about it today, but I think the only thing that will make the change is like massive people power, and the youth strikes, the global youth strikes have been unbelievable in terms of massive people power, and it's it's something that really like gives me hope, And I think we talk a lot about tipping points, well, we do anyway, the climate science does. And we, this idea of tipping points where suddenly something gets worse or suddenly something changes. And I'm used to thinking of them as bad things, but like political change often comes in terms of like major, at some point the pressure is enough, and then suddenly, there'll be major changes, and that's what we need. But I think there is like there's such a high proportion of people in the world are now concerned about climate change. Huge amount of that is down to young activists, and I mean, it's got to change it, but it's going to be hard because the old system does not want to go away.
No, so I think, I agree. I suppose there are going to be corporations and politicians, and if they are forced into thinking by mass participation that they have no electoral or kind of commercial future in the current system, they will try and change. So, they can be led in that way by mass movements. And so I hope that that is the case. I think like young people are at the heart of like all of the climate activism that's come about in the past few years in a way that, I don't, it certainly wasn't the case when I was a teenager. I think, I can't remember what we were interested in the 90s, but it wasn't climate activism, let me tell you. So, and I think we are seeing it from lots of organizations and lots of like corporations and stuff like that, like a lot of greenwashing and a lot of like, do you remember that Pepsi advert where it had one of the Kardashians putting a flower in a policeman's like rifle and all this kind of stuff? This kind of like corporate activism and I think, I think there is a younger generation that sees through this rubbish and that is going to demand meaningful change and can like choose other businesses and other ways. So I hope that will kind of force like meaningful change, because I think a lot of the, if lip service will make people go away and the system can carry on as it is, then the system will carry on as it is. And I think, if there's enough people that says we're not going to buy your product or vote for your party, we're going to do a different thing.
Or simply, participate in the system, we're not going to go to school on Fridays. Or the interesting thing with the XR protests is if there's enough people, then the police, it takes the police a really long time to arrest everyone. So this kind of thing, our system is based on consent. And most of the time we forget that. But the system cannot withstand a massive amount of people challenging it. So that's what we've got to go for.
Yeah, I think when we were thinking about your question earlier on, my answer was no. And now my answer is going to be yes, hopefully. Because otherwise, I mean, God, what else is there to do?
It depends what you've read on the day, doesn't it?
Mm.
And Scott,
Yeah, no, just kind of building back on what your answer was there, because I think that's such a brilliant answer, is I do think a lot of people forget there is power in numbers. Like you're saying, our system is only there because we allow it to be. So my kind of question, building on that, would be, obviously, I think sometimes people are a little bit hesitant to get involved with kind of uprooting the system and, kind of telling the government what they think and what they feel. So would you guys have any advice for young people about that? Do you have any advice for them about this idea of, standing up to the system?
We have not yet uprooted the system.
No, but we went to London for the first rebellion, the second rebellion in London. So the first Extinction Rebellion rebellion was on the bridges, and that was in like September and October, November or something, 2018. And then we all went to London in April of 2019. And like 2 weeks before, the Green Party in Scotland proposed that the government declare a climate emergency. And they lost 150 to 7 or something like that. They were presumably laughed out of the chamber, you know. And then like all of these people like blocked loads of roads in London, and we were a part of that. And like we were part of this thing that we thought, you know, is impossible. It's impossible just to go to Parliament Square and set up camp and stay there, you know. And we did it for a week, and there were like thousands of people doing all of this stuff. And then and it got to the point where the police were coming to arrest people. I'm not advocating all of these tactics, but the police came to arrest people, and then eventually they left. You know, they had to de-arrest people. They couldn't take any more people away. Like the system, like creaked, audibly creaked, and like people, like the government did not know what to do. And when we got the train back a week later, like there was Nicola Sturgeon declaring a climate emergency. There was Michael Gove declaring a climate emergency. And okay, on reflection, what impact did that declaration of a climate emergency like have? Some of it was lip service that has not like translated into huge action. But all of these people turned up and forced change in a way that like we'd never experienced or seen or even hoped for.
I think like certainly say to anyone who's like getting involved with activism, like be kind to yourself and be gentle. As you know, like it can feel so urgent that you can burn yourself out completely. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of like acting in that kind of like desperation and like this has to change, and there's a lot of high emotion. So like look after yourself, whatever you do, and find whatever the right thing for you is. And you know, whether that is like planting trees or making a pond, or whether it's like going to the government and demanding change. And one of the most interesting and kind of empowering things that I've done recently was like learn about the economic system and look into radical economics. And Kate Raworth's book, Donut Economics, is like a really great starting point. So understanding how much of what we take for granted is actually a choice, is actually like not set in stone. It's something that's changeable. I think that is really good. And, you know, I said earlier that I think one of the strengths that young people bring to the movement is like young people aren't sort of within the system in the same way of like, oh, but that would be complicated, or this would just be that. So like holding on to some of that clarity about, you know, what has to change. And, you know, there's a need for like pragmatism and doing things carefully and that kind of stuff. And there's also a need for people to say, this is just wrong, it has to change. So like learning about the system, about capitalism, about colonialism, economics. Less is More is another fantastic book, Jason Hickel.
Yeah.
In fact, I read it and then I bought like 5 copies and I just gave them to everybody.
I think we're told, like we kind of taught, and the history of like economics as a subject has been around like establishing economics as like a science in the same way of like physics as a science or chemistry as a science. And like there are inimitable laws of economics and the market and all this kind of stuff that, you know, it's just the way it is, you know, it is just the way it is, you know, I have loads and you don't. And that unfortunately is just like the laws of the market or whatever. And it's really interesting. We did a really interesting course with an organisation called Enough Scotland, and they do a lot about like economics and degrowth and stuff like that, and read lots of interesting books. And turns out it's not an inimitable law, and it turns out that it is a political choice. And there's been lots of like, and it's quite interesting to kind of realize, then we can just make different choices, you know, and there's a huge power in that. You know, you need a lot more force some of those decisions to be made and those different choices. But to even realise that there is a possibility of a different way is a good thing.
And I think there's a great book and all sorts of resources called Active Hope, which is about how to kind of stay sane during climate breakdown and in being involved in activism. And it's interesting to kind of think of that. I know there's three, but I can only think of two distinctions. But there's like people who, there needs to be effort in challenging the status quo and saying no to this, no to that. But also, like, we need, like, for our souls, I think, we need to balance that with, like, what do I want? And, like, how do I be part of something that's the future I want? And, like, building the future. And I think we burnt ourselves out by doing too much of the first kind. And then when we had the lockdown, particularly me, I just made like wildlife gardens everywhere that I could get my hand on and made ponds and planted trees. And it's good to have a balance and do something that's positive, and also just do some stuff that isn't to do with climate activism as well. Like, make sure that there's part of your life that isn't nothing to do with it.
And Paolo, you have a question now.
Thank you. So, but it's still not just young people. What can any of us do to be part of the change the world needs in general, in a more, not young people again, but just more adults now? Yeah,
everyone. I think there's a really great science project called Project Drawdown, and I've got a book of it. We've got a book of it in our house, but it's also a website, and they show the top 100 ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So particularly looking at climate change. And I think that thing of like net zero is like not enough. So looking at like net negative. So they look at all the different ways that humans can affect change in terms of carbon in the atmosphere, and they rate them like 1 to 100, and I think there's like goes to 200 as well. And they say, look at this list. Whatever makes you excited, do that thing, and be part of that thing. And it's really broad. So there's like, there's some there's things that we know, like food waste, dealing with food waste. There's regenerative agriculture. There's solar panels. There's that kind of stuff. But there's also like weird stuff, like feeding cows on seaweed to reduce methane, or a system called marine permaculture around like growing fish and sea vegetables. And there's the third most influential thing that people can do is like a combination of educating women and like educating girls and empowering women. So like amazing. If that is what makes you excited, then like put your effort into educating girls, because it's like scientifically shown that it also contributes to carbon reduction. So a huge variety of types of thing. I think find what makes you excited, and try and just whatever it is that's your part of a better future, then go for that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to do. There is lots to do. So if you have the space and the ability and the physical kind of capacity to like plant loads of trees, and that's your thing, then you can do that. And if it's like education, like Kate says, or if it's like, run for office, join the council, join your local community council, and like make change in your local community, or like campaign for something on your street. Maybe it's different types of food waste or less cars or whatever it is. Be involved in stuff. There's huge amounts of change, and lots of it doesn't happen because there aren't enough people on, in the council, or like making it happen or forcing things to happen. One of the things that like has really inspired me and like what we have done has been the realization that like-minded people can gather together with very little resources and make stuff happen. Things that you just never thought was possible, and suddenly we're camping outside Parliament, or we're like doing stuff at the Scottish Parliament, or 20,000 people have turned up, organised by school children at Holyrood. There is stuff to do, and there is, like Katie says, like whatever the thing is that you're like, I'm super passionate about that, there is a way for you to be involved, and that might be time or resources, or might be like giving £5 to like an Indigenous group fighting a pipeline in America, or whatever it might be. There's a huge range, and
we collected together for the last 1.5 degrees live thing that we did. We collected together, a big long list of links of a variety of things that people get involved with, so we can share those with you if that would be useful. And it's just us, a kind of a little kind of gathering together thoughts. So it's not comprehensive at all, but it's got a bit of a variety.
And also, I think like we're being told a lot of stuff by the government, or there's a lot of like greenwashing happening. There's a lot of like BP or Chevron or Exxon asking us to check our carbon footprint. Imagine being asked by Exxon to check your carbon footprint. I mean, like the absurdity of it all. So we have to be quite good at like discerning what information we are receiving and how we respond to that, and what is a reliable source of information. And that's not to say that I am like that reliable source of information, but we have to like all collectively be quite smart about what are we researching, who are we believing, and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to be told a lot, especially in the next few weeks, about how Great Britain is at like reducing like emissions, and like it is not true. And like how we're like a world leader in Scotland and in the UK and all that kind of stuff. It is not true, but we're going to be told a lot of that stuff.
Can I pick up on that last words? It's out of the script, but where can we gather this kind of information? What to do? What steps I need to do? Where can we gather this information from?
One of the things, if Katie and Patrick send it to myself, we'll then add this into the podcast. So you'll have the audio, and then underneath there, you'll also have all the links that Patrick and Katie can send to us, and you'll have those lists there. And certainly we'll try and include that in on the website as well.
Yeah, and it's not an exhaustive list that we have. There's loads and loads and loads and loads, but we've certainly tried to gather all the ones that we've encountered, and we just we've got loads and loads, and we put them on a big list, and we made them super public at our most recent event. And we were just thinking, God, I hope none of these people turn out to be like secret eco-fascists or like funded by an oil company or something, because there's a lot of that kind of stuff as well. But I think there's huge amounts of like questionable stuff flying around on Facebook and Twitter and social media about COVID and masks and vaccinations, and we will see similar stuff around climate change and refugees and all of this, like creating a debate and all that kind of stuff. And that is going to be a challenge that we are going to face as like one political system is forced to change by another by another kind of uprising system. That old way, those oil companies are not going to be like, actually, you know what? My bad, we're going to give all of our money back to, the activists or the communities or whatever. These big entities are going to fight for their market share in all sorts of different ways. So,
coming back to the thing that we know, actually the IPCC, if you want to know the state of climate change, the IPCC is super reliable. It gets criticized for being too radical by people that don't like it, but it gets criticized for being kind of behind the times because it's a rigorous scientific method, but then it also gets like signed off by governments. So if you want to see something that is signed off by essentially the world scientists, the UN and governments, then the IPCC, all of their reports are available on their website. They are not the most people-friendly reading, but also, you know, it's doable. We did it. It's, you know, it's understandable, some of it, and it takes, you know, a little bit of thinking. But they always produce headlines and like key points and summaries and frequently asked questions. So if you ever in doubt of like what the state of the science is, then that is a really fabulous resource, and that's what it's designed for. Yeah,
and it's all publicly available in various languages, and yeah, it's good.
So yeah, we'll have the notes for that, links for that, everything in the show notes that will go with the podcast. Now, Michael, I believe you have a question now.
You've both emphasised the need for mass people power. However, I'm sure you're both aware both Insulate Britain and Extinction Rebellion have gathered a lot of negative media attention over the last few weeks with the protests. Is that an effective recruitment strategy?
I mean, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. I think it's really complicated. I think they're all over the media. Everybody's talking about like Insulate Britain, and when it was XR blocking roads and causing, you know, big disruption and all that kind of stuff in London and other cities around the world, you know, it was Extinction Rebellion all over the media. So people are, you know, it's front page news, you know, those activist groups, and if they are able to communicate why they're doing what they're doing, if that communication is clear and good, then it can be a really effective way of like sharing what those aims are and what those goals are. So I think in that sense, it can be a good recruitment tool. I think there has been a lot of like negative pushback about certain actions as well. I remember like the guys on top of the train in London last year, and obviously like in the Insulate Britain, there's a lot of kind of very angry motorists and lots of people like quite angry about it. So in that sense, it could put people off. Yeah,
it's an interesting thing, and I think like all major like civil movements, there's like there's a radical wing and there's a mainstream, and then there's like super gentle, and you need all of those kind of things. So, you know, looking at the suffragette movement or the women's suffrage movement in the UK, there was like 30 years of writing letters and talking to MPs, and there was mass protests that were like illegal by the suffragettes, and you know, they got to the point where they bombed the house of a MP, and you know, that kind of stuff, I'm not advocating that at all, but like, you know, I think now we look back and we're like, oh yeah, of course, rights for women, what a wonderful campaign, and what a great thing. But it was like super diverse, and there was some very questionable bits of it, and it's kind of, you know, it's an interesting thing. We don't, you know, what Insulate Britain I don't think they're looking to mass recruit to that tactic, potentially, but you can do any number of marches and never make even page 83 of a newspaper.
So we've been on those marches.
And the thing with the climate movement is the climate movement's existed for decades and decades and decades and done loads and loads and loads and loads of stuff. And carbon emissions have gone up every single year. So what we know is that everything that's been tried before, yes, there's small successes, but nothing has turned it around. So it's interesting that first Extinction Rebellion protest with the Fridays for Future like momentum at the time, that made a significant change in terms of language. We're still not seeing emissions come down. But being polite and polite protest is not historically shown to be effective. So we will see. I think we will see.
So whilst you try to gather support, do you think that stopping working people getting to the work, stopping ambulances getting to and from hospitals is going to increase that support from people? Or
so I think there's a real range, and obviously, people being disruptive will be, like, at least some people will be pretty annoyed about that. As far as I'm aware, like Extinction Rebellion protests have always moved aside for ambulances and any
emergency vehicles.
I'm just referencing the protest yesterday where the woman was trying to get to hospital and they wouldn't get out of the way of the road.
I haven't seen that.
That was from Insulate Britain. That was from Insulate Britain, and there was a spokesperson had a quote from yesterday, and they said, "We share the frustration of the people delayed on the roads of Wandsworth. The protest could end immediately if government issues a meaningful statement that we can trust on insulating our houses."
Yeah, I mean, we're not representatives of or spokespeople.
I know.
Britain, so we can't speak directly to that kind of comment or the action. I mean, I agree that it is super contentious to be stopping people getting to work. I don't think there's any need. From the experiences I've had on protests that I've been on, they've always allowed emergency vehicles to go through, and that has been a very strong part of the tactics to make sure that those are allowed to happen. Mm-hmm. I think if that you can easily turn people off your cause if you irritate everybody. So there is a real balancing act to find in those tactics, and they're certainly not always done correctly. One of the things I would say is that the mass actions in London did have big impact, and it's really good to see those mass actions because the diversity and the range of people really makes a big statement. And being, unfortunately, those big protests, peaceful protests, get ignored. So the temptation is to be more disruptive and more disruptive, and then organisations can get into the situation which you mentioned yesterday, and similar situations like that, which can be problematic. I mean, it's very difficult. I'm not advocating.
It's just that you're I'm not tarring you on that brush. It's just that you're on the same team essentially. So I'm seeing you as a voice of that cause. I just wondered what you thought about those tactics.
Yeah, we're all on the same team. I think blocking ambulances and emergency vehicles is not something that I would advocate. I mean, blocking roads I've been a part of, and I can see the value of some of those in protests, but I certainly wouldn't advocate for the blocking of emergency vehicles.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
Thank you.
And with that, I just wanted to ask, do you think the educational establishment could be doing more?
Well, it's interesting this because we have both been out of education for ages. So, in a sense, you guys are probably the people that know whether the educational establishment could be doing more. I think probably everyone could be doing more. It's been really great to see, Glasgow University was one of the first universities to divest its money from fossil fuels. So that's a really positive thing that, we would like to see all universities do. And that's a growing thing across the educational establishment. In terms of what you guys get taught and what's being taught in nowadays, we're very out of touch with that. My thoughts, coming back to that idea about so much being put on young people for planning for the future, training for the future, whatever. I think probably it's not the educational establishment that needs to lead this. It's government and media. But having said that, there's places where I've been waiting for Edinburgh adult education to be putting on something about climate change in its adult education programme, and I feel like I would love to see the universities like leading on that and making that more accessible, or colleges, or the botanics, or whoever people out there that are providing education. I think in terms of the stuff that's accessible to adults, I don't see the stuff that I would love to see in terms of like carbon literacy or understanding better how this works, introduction to climate change, whatever it is that we could all be learning. I don't see that. But I think you guys will have a better idea than us about what that feels like within education.
Yeah, I think there's lots of interesting debates happening around education. There's lots of pressure on universities around like empire and like safe spaces and like all sorts of like pressure on universities. But we've got friends who like study. What does Hannah do? What course does she do? She works in she's like geosciences, and everybody's getting approached by oil and gas companies to work in oil and gas companies, and the dinners are sponsored by oil and gas companies because the natural path of that department is to go and work in oil and gas companies, and has been for 100 years. That's what those departments are kind of about and for and sponsored by, and that's kind of what they do. So these are big entrenched kind of systems at some of these universities and educations, and it's going to take a long time to change some of those. So, but there's certainly pressure, I think, to do that. But yeah, certainly what's happening in school and stuff, I don't know. Other than I occasionally see people tweeting about that thing at school when you have to find talk about the good stuff about climate change, and hopefully that's gone.